We were discussing how the Philippine-American War evolved, whereby initially it was more of a conventional war, whereby you had two opposing armies on the same battlefield in military conflict. But then eventually the Philippine Liberation Army realized it could not win. In fact, they were being routed, as uh, we mentioned. And therefore, this forced the Philippine military leaders to assume a guerrilla stance or guerrilla approach to fighting the U.S. Army. And guerrilla warfare involves indirect conflict. It involves hit and run tactics. It involves ambushing. And because of this unconventional or asymmetrical approach, as it's called today, this led to mounting frustrations among the military leaders and U.S. troops, and therefore they it started to engage in more torture of captives, as we mentioned, and as depicted in the slide with the water cure. But not just torture, we also see what we could call war crimes today. The indiscriminate killing of civilians, even children, which we'll discuss in a second. You see civilians rounded up and forced into concentration camps. You see entire villages destroyed. And add to that, much loss of life due to diseases and starvation, which was a direct effect of all what was happening to them. So, this is what's happening, these horrific cases of, inordinate loss of life experienced by even civilians. Okay, so this is what's happening at the time during the second phase of the war, which is, again, it's the guerrilla phase. But, the guerrilla phase lasted quite a bit of time. It lasted for more than a year. Now, let's look at some songs of war here. These are army marching songs, okay? And some of them are quite revealing. For example, this one, Damn, Damn, Damn the Filipino, pockmarked Cacac Ladrone, underneath the starry flag, civilize him with a crag, and return us to our own beloved home. So, civilize him with a crag. A crag was the latest technology in rifles back then, the crag rifle. And here they're saying, we need to civilize those Filipinos, but we're going to do it with military force. So, again, this goes back to, the civilizing mission, but you're using, bullets and bayonets, right, to do this. And then here's one that reveals torture, namely the water cure. Get the good old syringe, boys, and fill it to the brim. We've caught another N-word, and we'll operate on him. Let someone take the handle who could work it with vim, shouting the battle cry freedom. Shove in the nozzle deep, and let him taste of victory. Okay, now, this grabs our attention not only because of the torture, but the racial epithet here. And this is one thing that was happening on this what we call the new frontier, right? We acknowledge that it's an extension of the Indian War, right? But it's also a war between two races and two civilizations, okay? And because of this, you see this racial language, and it wasn't only during the war, but even during, as we mentioned, debates for annexation. You heard terms like barbarous and senile peoples. You'll hear terms like primitive and savages and uncivilized. And all of these are suggestive of how the Filipinos are biologically unfit, to use the words or the terms of social Darwinism here, which was quite popular. Biologically unfit, compared to the Westerners. Now, because it was a race war, as I just described, right? They're fighting in a new frontier. And let's remember, they're not in the continent of North America. They're actually going overseas fighting this strange, unknown enemy from their perspective, the Filipino native. So they'll use words like primitive, savage, but also invent their own word as well as use common racial epithets that they used at home. So they call them savages, they call them the N word, but they also invented new terms. And the new term that was invented here is gugus for Filipinos. Okay, they call them gugus. And this would evolve, by the way, to gook. And this would be used a lot in Vietnam, during the Vietnam War. If you watch any, film on the Vietnam War made in the United States, well, you'll hear the word gook a lot. Okay, so the Philippine War was indeed a race war here. Again, a war between two races. Now, it also involves gender here, interestingly enough. Okay, here's gender ideology at this new frontier. Okay, let's remember that the Filipino men were racialized as being lacking in manliness and so forth. And therefore, the killing of Filipino men was indeed justified due to their supposed lack of masculinity. Again, the gendered language of Filipinos as weak, unmanly, and this is despite the heroics they displayed on the battlefield. I described it as nearly fanatical, if you recall. But what added an extra dimension to this was guerrilla warfare again. Guerrilla warfare that the Filipinos adopted in their resistance was chided as cowardly, as unmanly, as uncivilized, and therefore this was used to, as I mentioned, justify the, quote, uncivilized methods, unquote, used by Americans, like torture, right? Like the killing of innocents, civilians. So you could see how gender and race figure into this war in a new frontier. Now, for African American men in the U.S. Army and Navy, it was an interesting time because here was a time where they could join the military ranks and even go abroad and, express their martial spirit and fight in this war. Okay. But we also know this is a time of Jim Crow segregation. Of course, the military was segregated. You don't see, all the different races of soldiers mixing. No, they're segregated according to skin color. So you had the formation of black regiments and black units and so forth. And again, it's an interesting case where you have African Americans who are dark skinned, of course, going to fight the gugus, to use that term, right? But let's remember they also called Filipinos the N-word. They called them savages and so forth. So when you think about the African American enlistee during the Philippine-American War, well, they faced racism within their own ranks, from their white officers who belittled them due to their skin color, from white soldiers, and Philippine guerrillas began to recognize this, and they began to try to persuade African American troops to join their side, okay, because they said, hey, you know what, you are not treated fairly in your own army. In fact, they treat you as inferior just by simple virtue of your skin color. And that's what they're doing to us. It's a race war, to use our term. And therefore, you should join our ranks and fight against the U.S. Army, right? And there were some isolated incidents of African Americans actually leaving the U.S. Army, right? And even deserting and joining the Philippine guerrillas. Now, it didn't happen, en masse, of course not. But one interesting example was this guy named David Fagan, who actually deserted because of that racial consciousness. and he joined the guerrillas and was actually given commission by Aguinaldo's army. Okay, so he became an officer and in 1899. And eventually he was captured and he was indeed executed. All right, but that's a quite well-known story of David Fagan, who it's an interesting example because how race forced him to switch sides, to desert his own country, his own army, and join the resistance movements. Now, as the U.S. Army began to move southward to the middle area that we call Visayas, well, they began to see more guerrilla attacks upon them. And one well-known one was the Balangiga massacre that happened in 1901. And here's a case whereby there was an encampment of American soldiers, and while they were waking up and about to eat their breakfast, they got attacked by Philippine guerrillas. They snuck into the camp and only used their native machetes, what we call bolos, okay? And they basically hacked to death dozens of American troops who really couldn't defend themselves at that time because of a surprise attack. And because of this loss of life, you have to remember the U.S. Army is not used to losing that many troops in a lopsided way. Well, this enraged Americans, and in particular the general who was in charge of the army. He ordered the island that this happened on, this island called Samar, he ordered Samar to be turned into a, quote, howling wilderness. Okay, hence he got the nickname Jacob Howland Smith. So he was asked about what to do here. And basically Smith replied, I want no prisoners. I wish you to kill and burn. The more you kill and burn, the better it will please me. I want all persons killed who are capable of bearing arms in actual hostilities against the United States. So the officer asks, I would like to know the limit of age to respect. And he says 10 years. Officer wants clarification. Persons of 10 years and older are those designated as being capable of bearing arms? General Smith says yes. Okay, so the order here is to kill everyone 10 and over. And that's indeed what happened. Any boys who were 10 and over, they killed them, as shown in this illustration. Okay, so this led to war crimes being committed. Now, Smith would subsequently be court-martialed for this order, but nonetheless, it provides you with an idea of what's happening here in this conflict against the Philippine guerrillas. You have the killing of civilians, even young children, and ultimately thousands of civilians were murdered, as I mentioned. Okay, now, in terms of casualties during the Philippine-American War, American casualties amounted to roughly 4,000 through the years of the war, around that number. When it came to Filipino casualties, and this includes civilians, it's hard to estimate because they can't really measure with exact and precise accuracy. But a conservative estimate is around 400,000 Filipinos who perished during the Philippine-American War. But some historians argue that you have to figure into the casualty numbers death and caused by disease and epidemics and other related deaths, that are correlated to war. So one historian argues that it's more like close to 1 million that died. If we take in account, all the epidemics that occurred and civilian deaths resulting from the concentration camps and what have you. So that should make the mind real here. 1 million people who could have died during this conflict.